Welcome to The Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. It's March 8th, 2024. In this episode, we're talking about the state of the 2024 U.S. presidential election.
But before we get to that, I want to circle back to what we talked about last week with genetic engineering and some of the potential ramifications of that in the future. I wanted to flesh out a little more the idea that eugenics was 120 years ago predominantly a leftist cause. In the intervening years, it's become associated with the right on account of being a taboo that is effectively a bad word that can't be spoken of positively. And then in the future, if it redounds back to the left, I think it will fit into the framework of sort of the legacy of slavery, the legacy of systematic oppression, and some of the consequences of that. Right now, that's sort of an amorphous idea. But if it has genetic underpinnings to go along with it, I think that will lend credence further to the argument that it is a moral obligation for the state and for the institutions of power, the governing institutions in society, to allow and to subsidize genetic engineering to help rectify that legacy and the damage that it has caused and the retardation that it has effectively caused the social development of groups, most notably blacks, but other historically underprivileged, historically oppressed groups.
That would be a 180 on what their position is now, because I think what you're saying, that would imply that part of the reason that African Americans are in the position they're in is because of what their genetic history is and when they were slaves, who their slave masters had them breed with based on, I guess, certain negative traits. And so because of that legacy of manipulation by their masters, their genetic makeup is somehow flawed or disadvantaged in some way. And that's not at all the position that they would be appalled by that argument now, that the argument for why African Americans are where they are is because of the systems of oppression and white supremacy. It's everything environmental. It's nothing. They would never say there's anything in the DNA of black people that makes them the way they are, or that accounts for their negative position in society.
Correct. This would be a sea change in terms of the embrace of human biodiversity as it applies to humanity because of the big benefit in so making that change. And so I think the rhetoric would follow. Right now, when they talk about underprivileged and underserved minority communities, with a little bit of pressure, they will admit generally that these communities have lower levels of education. And so that means that manifests as lower abilities, lower competencies in the modern Western capitalist markets. But they don't outright deny that those lower levels of education exist and that they need to be rectified. And so I think the same thing would be the case with genetic engineering. And it's not like they would be responsible for the genetic situation that they were in. That would still be blamed on the white supremacist, broader structural society for keeping them in that position or forcing them to breed, et cetera, et cetera. There are ways rhetorically to admit to the problem, the reality that needs to be fixed, without assigning any sort of culpability to those who need the, quote, fixing, unquote. Now it's because of a racist society that they've received poor education. Well, in 20, 30, 40 years from now, it could be that they have received a poor genetic inheritance because of racism and white supremacy, and that needs to be rectified.
The first thing I want to talk about is the recent United States Supreme Court decision regarding Trump's eligibility to be on the primary ballot in the state of Colorado. I talked about this a few weeks ago when the Colorado Supreme Court issued its opinion, and now it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they finally rendered their verdict earlier this week, first week of March 2024. And a brief recap of what the Colorado Supreme Court ended up finding. That trial court in Colorado found that Trump had engaged in, quote, engaged in insurrection within the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And the trial court said that Section 3 didn't apply because the presidency is not considered a, quote, office under the United States. Then it went up to the Colorado Supreme Court, and they reversed the trial court decision and said the president is a, quote, officer of the United States within the meaning, and they said thus Trump should be removed from the ballot. And the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the Colorado Supreme Court and says Trump has to be on the ballot, and that it was improper for him to have been kicked off. And the reasoning of the U.S. Supreme Court is quite similar to the dissent of the Colorado Supreme Court. And so the Colorado Supreme Court dissenting opinion stated that the 14th Amendment specifically gives Congress absolute power to enact legislation to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And just to recap, too, on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment bars anyone who has taken an oath of office previously and then engaged in insurrection. They are prevented from holding federal office. And bottom line is the U.S. Supreme Court says that the Congress is the entity that has to take action to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So it's not something that states can do on federal office. So the states are not allowed to kick someone off running for either Congress or U.S. Congress or U.S. Senate. That has to be done by the federal government. And I don't really think there's much else to say on that. The U.S. Supreme Court did state that the 14th Amendment, quote, expanded federal power at the expense of state autonomy and thus, quote, fundamentally altered the balance of state and federal power struck by the Constitution. So in some ways it was more of a liberal decision in terms of a states' rights position, because Colorado was taking the position that basically a states' rights position, that as a state they have the ultimate authority to determine how they're going to run their elections. And the Supreme Court says no, the 14th Amendment, maybe pre-14th Amendment, that would have been the case, but they're arguing that, and that's in many ways why it's called the second founding, because it really did almost 100 years after the founding of the country change fundamentally the relationship between the federal government and the states. And this is another example, one of many examples of that, to where the state doesn't have absolute right to run their elections. And so the bottom line of this case is summarized with this quote from the opinion. We conclude that the states may disqualify persons holding or attempting to hold state office, but states have no power under the Constitution to enforce Section 3 with respect to federal offices, especially the presidency. And then they went on to talk about the chaos that could ensue if different states had different procedures for the same candidate. They said conflicting state outcomes concerning the same candidate could result not just from differing views of the merits, but from variations in state law governing the proceedings that are necessary to make Section 3 disqualification determinations. Some states might allow a Section 3 challenge to succeed based on a preponderance of the evidence, while others might require a heightened showing. And they just complained that this could result in a patchwork that would result from state enforcement severing the direct link that the framers found so critical between the national government and the people of the United States as a whole. So the TLDR of this is Trump's going to at least be on the ballot. So next thing I want to talk about is the State of the Union address. It was given yesterday, so March 7, 2024. Could be Biden's final State of the Union. We'll see. I read the transcript of the speech. I couldn't bring myself to watch all 60 plus minutes of it. But so I read the speech and then I looked at a few clips. And so I'm just going to give a few thoughts I had. The first thing I noticed that the third sentence of the speech mentions Hitler. And I just thought, of course, it's so tiresome. Every situation in geopolitics, when there's a bad guy or something bad, it's Hitler. Oh, we can't stop. We can't let Hitler win again. And then he says, freedom and democracy are under assault in the world. I think it's an interesting juxtaposition to have this speech the same week as the U.S. Supreme Court decision regarding Trump being on the ballot, to where I think most Democrats were in agreement that democracy is so important that the people can't be allowed to vote for the candidate of their choice. And then in Europe, in Ukraine, democracy is so important that they can't hold elections in Ukraine. The elections have just been suspended indefinitely. And it's worth pointing out that the United States has never not held elections. Even in the middle of the Civil War in 1964, we had the presidential election. So I just don't see how you can say we're fighting for democracy and then the country that is in the front lines fighting for democracy just chooses not to hold elections.
3 days before this speech, YouGov and The Economist concluded a poll in which some 89% of respondents who intend to vote for Joe Biden in 2024 say that Trump should be disqualified from being allowed to run for president, while just 6%, so barely 1 in 20 intended Biden voters think that Trump should be allowed to be on the ballot at all in the 2024 presidential election. So you have, in the name of defending democracy, you have an overwhelming, massive majority of Biden supporters indicating a desire for their political opponent to be removed from the ballot so that the democratic process cannot be undertaken.
Later in the speech, Biden said, quote, "If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. But Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons it needs to defend itself. That is all Ukraine is asking." And I think that, again, indicates why he brought up Hitler in the beginning, because the whole framework, the prism that almost every geopolitical event is seen through is it's World War II, it's 1939, Czechoslovakia, invading Poland, Neville Chamberlain appeasing Hitler. If we don't stop him now, before you know it, he's going to take France, he's going to take all of Western Europe and then the world. It's that same framework, and it's just taken for granted by many people that Putin won't stop at Ukraine. And rather than what seems much more likely is that he genuinely just wants the eastern provinces of Ukraine. There's no strong evidence to think that he's going to go into the rest of Eastern Europe and into Western Europe. But the way Biden is framing it is, this is just the first step.
There was a peace treaty negotiation that was on the table that was ready to be signed in what was March or April of 2022, where Putin had agreed to stop the expansion and just take those eastern provinces in Ukraine that were majority ethnic Russian, where in plebiscites previously the overwhelming majority had voted to join Russia, and Russia had refused to allow those eastern provinces to join Russia. But the truth value of any of this isn't really what's important. Americans have been conditioned to be extremely anti-Russian in their sentiments, and it's very much a bipartisan sentiment. From that same YouGov poll that was referenced a moment ago, just some 7% of self-identified Republicans perceive Russia as either a friendly country or an ally to the United States, compared to 9% of Democrats. So Democrats are actually marginally more likely to view Russia favorably than Republicans are. That is almost exclusively due to black support, or support's probably not the right word, favorability that comes from blacks. Some 20%, so 1 in 5 blacks view Russia as either an ally or a friend to the United States, to American interests. That's something that manifests in all kinds of polls about international questions, where countries and peoples and movements that are conventionally perceived to be hostile towards the United States and to America are find more affinity among blacks, significantly so than among non-blacks in the United States.
And it would be interesting to trace the trend back maybe 30, I'd say post Cold War polling. It would be interesting to look at the polling on favorability among Americans towards Russia, because my first thought would be that the favorability among Democrats towards Russia would have taken a nosedive around 2015, 2016 with the whole Russiagate situation. But maybe that, and I would have also thought that Republican support for Russia would have gone up at least a little bit after 2015, 2016. But it sounds like maybe not. And the only explanation I can think of for why there'd be such hostility, or the best explanation for the hostility towards Russia, would be that lingering Cold War hangover.
Yeah, there's no question that is a big part of it. If you look at age demographics on the question, 22% of those under the age of 30 view Russia as an ally or a friend. That's Americans. So 22%, over 1 in 5, compared to just 3% of those age 65 or older. So there is about an order of magnitude higher likelihood for those under the age of 30 to view Russia as a friend or an ally than there is among those age 65 and older, who have been conditioned their whole lives through the Cold War, and then subsequently, after the Cold War, viewed Russia as a hostile actor in the late 90s in the Balkans War, and then through today, when a lot of the the vast majority of older Americans have been primed now to see Russia as a villain, with the idea of Russian interference in the 2016 election and Russian disinformation. It's also worth noting that Russians are white, so they make for the perfect villain. That Slavic deadpan white face is the perfect one to hate and be celebrated for that hate.
All right, so back to the State of the Union speech. There was a lot of appeal to January 6th, saying that American democracy is on the line, and that has been a consistent Democratic strategy since January 6th, 2021. And you could argue that it was relatively effective in 2022, or maybe at least mixed. The Democrats did lose the House, but they kept the Senate, and I don't think they lost as many seats in the House as they were expected to. But if this speech was any indication, that is going to continue to be arguably their number one fear tactic, that if we let Trump win, American democracy as we know it is over. So it remains to be seen whether that'll still be an effective strategy. You have any thoughts on that, Ness?
Well, I think it also lays the groundwork for legal approaches to remove or disqualify Trump from election or from assuming the presidency in 2025, even if it does appear that the electoral process favors him, by keeping an air of illegitimacy hovering over Trump, with the presumption, the ruling by the Supreme Court this week notwithstanding, just the presumption that Trump is illegitimate and that he should be disqualified, and that there are a lot of ongoing legal challenges that will disqualify him, even if they haven't yet, they will in the future. Having all of this up in the air provides ample opportunity for shenanigans should the election not come out the way that they want, or should some of these other challenges not manifest in a way that removes Trump from the ballot prior to the election in November. So I think it serves two purposes. Or really, it serves three purposes, the third purpose being that it takes the emphasis off of current problems that people perceive and will historically will generally blame the party in power, specifically the party that controls the presidency, for so things like continued inflation, higher prices, slower wage growth, and other economic concerns. The last thing that the Biden administration wants is for 2024 to be a referendum on the performance of the Biden administration over the last 4 years. It is much better for them if the focus is instead on Trump and on the specter of Trump returning and taking the country back culturally, if not economically, culturally, back to where it was in the late teens during Trump's first term.
Next, he mentioned abortion. Biden mentioned Roe v. Wade. And of course, there's just the fundamental dishonesty whenever this topic is brought up. They make it seem as if the Supreme Court took away people's right to abortion when that's not the case. It simply gave each state the right to determine abortion law, where it should have been from the beginning. The judiciary has no business saying whether abortion should be legal or not. That's a political decision that should be up to the states. But regardless, I think it is an effective campaign issue to run on, because most Americans are in support of abortion, at least in some cases. And the Republican, somewhat mainstream position is that abortion should be illegal.
That understandable presumption is a little bit dated. So there's the cliche about conservatism just being the shadow of progressivism or leftism, conservatism being progressivism 10 years later. And in the case of, this is to go back again to this survey that we've tapped a couple times here, YouGov asked respondents if they would support or oppose Congress passing a law banning abortions nationwide, and just 38% of Republicans support such a law, whereas 53% oppose. So even among Republicans, it is a minority position to ban abortions, at least abortions in all or most cases.
I stand corrected. That indicates that it is definitely a winning strategy for the Democrats to run on, claiming that the Republicans are wanting to ban abortion, because even Republicans don't seem to want that. And I agree with you on that, that Republicans or conservatism is just progressivism 10 years later. You see that on all kinds of issues. The most prominent one I can think of is gay marriage.
But over the longer term, the plot might thicken further. Among those under the age of 30, some 32% of respondents support a nationwide ban on abortion, while those under the age or over the age of 65, only 24% do. And among those aged 45 to 64, just 19% support a ban. So those under the age of 30, the Zoomers are more radical in a lot of ways socially. Those on the right are a lot more radical than older conservatives are. The cultural bifurcation generationally is a lot more pronounced among younger cohorts than it is among older cohorts. And while those under the age of 30 tend to be more left-wing in general, including on cultural issues than older cohorts do, that minority, that significant minority of Zoomers and younger millennials who are on the right are quite stridently and emphatically and firmly on the right.
Slight tangent, but on the intellectual basis for your pro-life or pro-choice position, this is something I've studied, thought about a lot in the past few years. I really came at the abortion issue with an agnostic mindset, but I think from an intellectually consistent standard, if you believe that life begins at conception, then it makes perfect sense why you would be against abortion in all cases. It doesn't make sense that if a life comes about through rape or through an accident or whatever the circumstances, that doesn't change the worth or the value of that human being. So that's just a side note.
Yeah, morally, it's perceived to be morally reprehensible to punish children for the actions of their parents. If at conception a baby, a human, has been created, then punishing that baby because the father raped the mother makes about as much sense as throwing a 5-year-old in jail for life because of a murder that his father or mother committed. And the same YouGov poll being referenced with regards to abortion also asks respondents to either agree or disagree with the assertion that abortion is murder. And among those aged 30 and younger, some 50%, half of respondents agree that abortion is murder. That is the highest percentage in agreement with that assertion of any age cohort that is queried.
Continuing on with highlights from the speech, or lowlights. Biden said at one point, "The pandemic no longer controls our lives. The vaccines that saved us from COVID are now being used to help beat cancer, turning setback into comeback. That's America." So thank God we had those vaccines. Otherwise, who knows where we would be right now. And let's see, next he said, great economic news, quote, "with historic job growth and small business growth for Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans." I think there was a racial group left off there, or maybe Native Americans, I'm not sure. Biden said, quote, "with the law I proposed and signed and not one Republican voted for, we finally beat Big Pharma." I wonder if mandating an experimental medical procedure that resulted in record profits for Big Pharma is also an example of beating Big Pharma. I'm not sure.
Even in selling his soul to the devil with Operation Warp Speed, Trump was still outraised by Biden among pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical representatives and manufacturing concerns by a 2-to-1 dollar margin. So Biden raised over twice as much money from Big Pharma as Trump did in 2020. And presumably after, quote, beating, unquote, Big Pharma, I suspect this time around Biden's advantage among pharmaceutical industry groups and lobbying organizations will be even wider than it was in 2020 without the payment that Trump received for pushing Operation Warp Speed and giving Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and Moderna and the other pharmaceutical companies that reliable cash stream, the cash cow that they received from the vaccines effectively being mandated or attempting to be mandated through 2021, 2022.
And nowadays, the percentage of Americans who are, quote, fully vaccinated is very low. I think it's under 20% at this point. So as I mentioned, I just read the speech, but then I did go to YouTube and look at certain segments. And the most interesting one was on the one on immigration. So I'm going to play that now.
In November, my team began serious negotiation with a bipartisan group of senators. The result was a bipartisan bill with the toughest set of border security reforms we've ever seen. Oh, you don't think so? Oh, you don't like that bill, huh? That conservatives got together and said it was a good bill? I'll be darned. That's amazing. That bipartisan bill would hire 1,500 more security agents and officers, 100 more immigration judges to help tackle the backload of 2 million cases, 4,300 more asylum officers, and new policies so they can resolve cases in 6 months instead of 6 years now. What are you against? 100 more high-tech drug detection machines to significantly increase the ability to screen and stop vehicles smuggling fentanyl into America. That's killing thousands of children. This bill would save lives and bring order to the border. It will also give me and any new president new emergency authority to temporarily shut down the border when the number of migrants at the border is overwhelming. The Border Patrol Union has endorsed this bill. The Federal Chamber of Commerce is, yeah. You're saying low. Look at the facts. I know you know how to read. I believe that given the opportunity for a majority in the House and Senate would endorse the bill as well, a majority right now. But unfortunately, politics has derailed this bill so far. I'm told my predecessor called members of Congress in the Senate to demand they block the bill. He feels political win. He viewed it as a political win for me and a political loser for him. It's not about him. It's not about me. I'd be a winner. Not really. Lincoln Riley, an innocent young woman who was killed by an illegal. That's right. But how many of thousands of people being killed by illegals? To her parents, I say, my heart goes out to you, having lost children myself. I understand.
So the play seems to be to try to shift the blame onto the Republicans for the disaster at the border. Joe Biden saying, I have a bill. This bill gives me the resources I need to take care of this issue, but Republicans are playing politics and are refusing to get behind this bill. And then, of course, he committed a major faux pas by using the term illegal, not once but twice, which is very taboo word for Democrats today.
Yeah, especially when it's used as a noun rather than as an adjective, as it was here on multiple occasions. It is funny to see a government union and the Chamber of Commerce both support the bill. What more could you possibly want? It does take a lot of chutzpah to believe that running on the idea that it is Republicans who are obstructionists about border security when there is the internet and there are videos in the past 4 years of Democrats demonizing Trump and Republicans and the MAGA movement in general for doing what they now claim that they think is the necessary common sense step to be taken. All the Trump campaign has to do is put together montages of Biden and other Democrats attacking the thing that they are now saying that they support.
And as if to hammer home how little the Democrats care about the collateral damage that occurs because of illegal immigration, Biden got the name of the young woman killed in Athens wrong. He called her Lincoln. Her name is Lakin. Or I should say her name was Lakin.
And if you just have the audio and not the visual of this, you're missing an aspect that makes it morbidly even funnier, because in the course of saying this, Joe Biden picks up a pen with her name on it, looks at it, presumably reads it, and then still pronounces the name incorrectly.
Last topic from the speech I wanted to touch on is Israel-Hamas. Biden started off the topic by saying, quote, the deadliest day for referring to October 7th, the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. So right away, the Holocaust was invoked. And he talked about how Israel has the right to defend itself. But then he, in a apparent attempt to assuage some of his younger Arab American voting base, he said, quote, Israel also has a fundamental responsibility to protect innocent civilians in Gaza. We've been working nonstop to establish an immediate ceasefire that would last for at least 6 weeks. And as we look to the future, the only real solution is a two-state solution. And he seems to be trying to walk a tightrope between appeasing his Jewish base as well as his Arab American base. And I think that may prove to be a Gordian knot, because how can you claim at the same time that Israel needs to do more to protect innocent civilians? The death tolls at over 30,000 now, majority women and children, and say Israel needs to do more, but at the same time doing nothing substantively to stop the flow of weapons and aid to Israel, directly facilitating what he claims they need to stop doing.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more cynical than that. There is wide, strong bipartisan support both at the political level and also at the grassroots level for Israel in Israel's struggle against Palestine. This is an issue where there is no political alternative. It's a rhetorical sop that Biden is offering his left-wing support base, because you're not even going to get this level of professed concern at at reining in some of the excesses Israel is perceived to be committing from Donald Trump or from Republicans. And so it's going to be, if your sympathies are with the Palestinians, or you find opposition to destroying large numbers of civilians and civilian infrastructure like Israel is engaged in, your choices are going to be between Joe Biden, who supports it but offers some rhetorical apprehensions against the worst excesses, and Donald Trump, who supports it more wholeheartedly.
And Donald Trump recently spoke out on the issue. He's been notably silent on the Israel-Hamas issue, other than saying, if I had been president, it never would have happened. But he recently said that Israel needs to, something along the lines of, finish the job. So it doesn't sound like he would be, I don't even know if he probably wouldn't even offer the rhetorical sop as you mentioned.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a Gordian knot to cut. This is just free political support, free rhetorical benefit with no cost for Biden to offer.
Yeah, and it remains to be seen, I suppose, if the uncommitted movement in Michigan and other states has any heft to it. I should clarify, there is a movement in Democratic primaries for people, instead of voting for Biden, to put uncommitted on the ballot as a way to protest what's happening in Gaza.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to pour a figurative libation for Nikki Haley. Her presidential candidacy ended this week. She has now effectively removed herself from Republican Party politics and fully transitioned into the K Street consultant lobbying sector of the political world. It's interesting to see these Republican candidates who challenge Trump trade any affinity that they have among the grassroots for praise and support and ultimately money and prestige and status from the anti-Trumpian, anti-MAGA establishment. Nikki Haley is now underwater in terms of her level of support and approval among Republican voters. Only 39% of Republicans view Haley favorably, as opposed to 51% who view her unfavorably. That's a negative 12 rating among Republicans, and it's not that much better than her perception among Democrats, where she has just a 28% favorable rating and a 58% unfavorable, so a net of negative 30. She doesn't do any better with independents, where she also has a net negative 13% favorability rating. So this person who was put up putatively to be the alternative to the Republican electorate's preferred presidential candidate is disliked by everyone. She is not viewed favorably by anyone across the partisan spectrum. And so that's what I'm referring to when I say that she has effectively ended her Republican political career. And there are a lot of politicians who have done this during the course of the Trump phenomenon. I think it's one of the greatest attributes that he has, one of the best consequences of his rise, his stellar rise to prominence, has been that it has caused so many of these despicable husks, these whorish people, to become nakedly revealed to be exactly what it is that they are.
All right. Well, first of all, she has simply suspended her campaign. She has not canceled. She hasn't thrown in the towel yet. So, frankly, I find your lack of faith disturbing.
The reason the campaigns are always suspended and not officially shut down is because then they are no longer able to receive donations. She will still be able to receive donations, and she'll be able to take that war chest that she has amassed in political donations and put it towards whatever political PACs or candidates that she supports in the future, or also roll it over into subsequent campaigns that she might run. Although, as I was alluding to previously, I don't think there is going to be much of a political future in terms of electoral politics for her. She has graduated now. She's gone through that revolving door where she will now be part of the pundit class, or the favorite, one of the favorite go-to, quote, Republican, quote, conservative, unquote, voices in opposition to Trump and to the MAGA movement and to America First and to any sort of hesitancy to plunge full on into wars all across the globe on behalf of the global American empire.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk to you next time.